Andrew Bailey, FCA CEO, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg TV.
Nice to see you.
So MiFID II, you've said that you're not going to take a sort of strict liability approach with firms that don't fully comply by January 3rd, but what steps will you take against firms that have made, in your words, no real or genuine attempt to be ready?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of work going on during the course of this year to make sure that we do everything we can, and firms obviously do everything they can to be ready. That's involved us, obviously, being out and about, as it were, making sure firms understand what's needed, that everybody knows what they need to do, and in a sense, sort of plotting out the timelines. And I have to say, we're not finding cases, as you might expect, of sort of deliberate refusal to help. So I'm reasonably comfortable with where we've got to. A lot to be done, as we might expect. And when we said no strict liability, what that really means is obviously the rules come into effect on the 3rd of January. Our supervision will then sort of take over, if you like, of the market and of firms. But obviously, we then work with firms to make sure that the thing is embedded, and that's very much a process that we do with firms. So I expect to be taking that forward as time evolves, and no doubt we'll find that there are some things that bed in better than others, and we'll have to and then address the things that are going less well. Firms will tell us about that.
Yeah, and I mean, you've already asked for paperwork to be submitted by July the 3rd. You say that many firms have met this deadline, but how concerned are you about the ones that haven't?
Well, at the moment, I say our overall view is we've had a good response following in a sense, the publicity we gave it in July, which was deliberate to say now that the time has come, as it were. Good response. So we're chasing down a few sets of the industry. Actually, often more, it's those sets for which it's all new. It's not so much a continuation of what came before with some changes. It's new, and so we have to sort of do a little bit more there to alert them to the fact that this is coming.
Sets like what, for example?
Well, some of the trading platforms where they've got, for instance, high frequency trading going on. That's a rather new world to them, I suspect.
Mm-hmm. So you've said you'll work with firms when January 3rd hits, but again with any firms that haven't made any real or genuine attempt to be ready, how hard and how will you come down on them?
Well, but during the rest of this year, there'll be some pretty firm messages going out saying, you really haven't made any progress. Don't please turn up on our door on 3rd of January and sort of, ask us to solve the problem in the morning. But that said, what we don't want, and this is why we've structured the work and the programme as it is, obviously we don't want to see dislocations on the 3rd of January or indeed any of the other days thereafter. So we've been very much focused on what we need to do to make sure that markets are functioning effectively. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the proportion you expect to be ready by January 3rd, high proportion, can you put a number on it at all?
High. Well, I think it's wrong to put a precise number on it in any way. There are so many different sectors and subsectors, but no, high proportion, yeah.
Now, there have been reports that 40 of the world's biggest asset managers and banks actually met with the FCA last week about MiFID II, and it was an attempt to get some clarity on the rules. Of course, a lot of people are still trying to get their head around them in time. Yeah. Now, the reports also said there was no solution to these meetings. Why not? What were the sticking points?
Well, there's only this meeting, which actually the industry, in a sense, convened, and we had some of my colleagues were there, is really about one particular issue, and it's about research. And the reason that this is an issue is that there is a very different approach towards paying for research in Europe, particularly Europe to be, obviously, with MiFID II, and in the US. So firms, have rightly pointed out that there is this, in a sense, sort of, difference of regimes. And they can, of course, get stuck in the middle of that. And so they've pointed out to the European authorities and to the US authorities. And of course, it has to be a European solution. So the European Commission and ESMA are involved in this, as are the American authorities. We've got to come to solutions to this. And I'll give you my view on this. This is an issue that we have to solve before the end of this year. We need to solve it in a pragmatic fashion. I don't want to see firms just feeling they're left in the sort of horns of a dilemma with, two sets of authorities pointing in different directions. What do we do? So, it needs to be a constructive approach. We're having constructive conversations. I think there are, various things that might be done. So the comment that, well, it isn't settled yet. No, it isn't settled yet, but the discussions are happening.
Sure, and you say, there are discussions around what might be done. What are some of the possible solutions that might be most favourable to you?
Well, I think there are discussions possibly about the way firms organise themselves, and so there's obviously a question about where the research is provided from. That's one set of discussions that can happen. There will be discussions between the authorities about how can we best, in a sense, reconcile these positions and sort of keep the necessary degree of sort of, in a sense, faith with the rules that are put in place. So I don't want to predict exactly what the outcomes will be, but what I would say, and I think this is be encouraging here, there is positive and constructive engagement, and everything I see on this, and by the way, the FCA, sense I'd say, can't solve this problem on its own, but I see at the moment an engagement which is in the spirit of, we know we've got to solve this issue.
Yeah, and how do the regulatory implications of Brexit complicate the implementation of MiFID II in the UK, if they do at all?
Well, that's interesting. So we're obviously implementing MiFID II as a member of the European Union. So we made that very clear from the day after the referendum, pretty much, that, of course, the UK, as long as the UK remains a member of the European Union, the UK has to go on implementing European Union law. MiFID II is, for us, I think, the biggest piece of implementation we will be doing during this period, and we're doing it. Now, but what comes hot on the heels of that is that in the context of the withdrawal legislation in the UK, we, working with the government, are having to go through all the legislation and the rules in our domain, as it were, that come from the European Union and work out how to transport them into UK legislation and rules. That's a big job. We're well underway. Now, obviously, that includes having to deal with MiFID II, amongst other things. So we're already having to work out how to transport it into UK legislation before we've implemented it fully in EU legislation, which is slightly challenging in terms of timetables and load, but we're having to do that, obviously, because the commitment of the UK is that on day one, post-Brexit, we essentially have the same framework of legislation and rules operating as we do on the sort of day before day one. And that's the point from which the UK goes forward.
Yeah. Does this in any way mean that, you'll have to adapt a little bit more as the FCA, and that therefore UK firms might get a little bit more time or leeway, or not?
Well, no, we're implementing MiFID II in Europe, as it were, as a member of the EU, in the same way as all other members of the EU. And then we're working out what it means to transport it into the UK, into UK realm. And just to give you a flavour of what that means, because it's like for like in that sense. But when you do this work, as we're having to do to work, say, well, how do we transport it? What you come up against is what we tend to call the inoperables. And that's broadly where the thing is framed, obviously, in a European Union institutional setting. And then you have to move it into a national UK setting. And so obviously the institutional structures are somewhat different. But the governing principle of doing it is, we're not amending it, altering it, changing it, saying, I've always wanted to do something there. That's not happening.
Right, but does it add another layer of complexity for UK firms, or no, not
Well,
for
we're
them?
doing it, the spirit of it is to really make it as like for firms as possible. Right. So we're not aiming to, we're not intending to say to firms, guess what, you've got to go through MiFID II implementation again. That should not, that's not our objective. No.
Sure. And when it comes to passporting for banks, of course, another big issue around Brexit, you've said that one of the biggest issues in your Brexit planning is how to go about these authorisations for EU firms operating in the UK. Now, do you have a framework in place, and will it be more lenient than the EU's framework once the UK leaves?
Well, I think the framework that we want and will have in place, certainly in my view, is first of all governed by the philosophy that we want to have open markets. As I've said publicly, I'm a strong believer in free trade and open markets. Now, obviously, it won't be the passport framework as such, because that's a function of European Union law. But my view is that it needs to be, directly equivalent, if you like. Now, what that means in terms of inward authorisations is that where obviously firms want to continue to operate in the UK as they have in the past using the passport system, we will need to devise a system of authorisations to allow them to do that. Now, the big question that we need to resolve is, does that mean that we have to find a way to do it all by day one, fully, start to finish? Or, as we have had experience domestically in the FCA of doing, we could use a system of so-called interim permissions. This is what we tend to call interim permissions or interim authorizations. Done it with consumer credit firms, for instance, in this country, where we essentially continue it's a sort of system of continuing the operation as before, and then we will, over a period of time, bring them properly and formally into a regime. That's worth looking at, in my view, for two reasons. One is the time available, purely practical matter of the time available. The second one, obviously, is that we then do have to have half an eye on what the future regime looks like in terms of the relationship between the EU and the UK, and also, of course, what any implementation period or transitional period, whatever you call it, looks like.
But as a regulator, how can you get this framework in place when you've just pointed to the fact that you need to know the nature of the future relationship between the UK and the EU, and that is still very unclear even at this stage?
Well, that's one reason why it could make sense to look at an interim regime, because then we would essentially be putting, if you think about it in airplane terms, into a holding pattern. If you thought we need to know more about where it's going to land eventually, and we don't know that yet. But I think it's important in terms of contingency planning that we have options available to us, and that we're not sort of saying, you know what, we're going to hit a wall at that point, and what do we do? So I think, from my point of view, because we have a lot of firms that potentially would want to continue authorization, we want them to continue authorization. We need that sort of option up our sleeve.
Yeah, I mean, you've said you don't intend to create a race to the bottom on deregulation, but you've also talked about the UK's principles-based approach in regulation versus the EU's rules-based approach. Does that mean that the UK could, though, still have an, perhaps not easier, but let's say more interpretative regulatory environment post-Brexit than the rest of the EU?
Well, first of all, I mean, I've been very clear all along, and fortunately, I think there is very broad consensus around this, that this is not about deregulating and having a free-for-all in the UK. I mean, after all, we've been through a global financial crisis. We've had some, really very difficult experiences. The regulatory framework we've put in place has been a response to that. No regulatory framework is perfect, but it's been a response to that. What I would say is that yes, you're right. There are differences between the UK approach and a continental approach. Part of that derives, of course, from having different legal systems, a common law system versus a different system on the continent. I think part of it also, in my assessment, arises by the challenge, and this is a legitimate challenge that the EU has always had, is having to, in a sense, make convergence work across 28 countries. If you could do that arguably by rules, or you could do it by supervisory convergence and harmonisation. The latter's quite hard, I think, to do quickly. I think the EU's preferred rules. Therefore, what I've said, and I've said this quite carefully and deliberately, yes, there has to be some scope, but the key thing is common outcomes. Having common equivalent outcomes, because say we've had hard experiences over the last 10 years. We all want the same things. Yeah.
When it comes to FinTech as well, some people concerned about the future of the FinTech industry post-Brexit. Will the UK regulatory environment be more open to FinTech than the rest of the EU? Will it need to be in order to attract those startups and the talent pool?
Well, I don't know about more open, because that obviously depends on at least two moving parts. I mean, we in the UK have been very open. The FCA, and it goes back before my time as chief executive, have been very open to FinTech. And I think, interestingly, and I saw this as a board member before I became chief executive, there's been a really important mindset change. People always say it's a parody of regulators, that we spend our whole time telling people what you can't do. And like all parodies, there's got to be some truth in it, otherwise it wouldn't exist. But the point is that there has been a mindset change, I think, to saying we do have a role as regulators to enable change. And I always use the word enable carefully. We're not picking winners. We're enabling change. We're having to ask the question, are there areas where, because our rule book was designed for a different age, if you like, of technology and use, it just gets in the way in ways that we should look at, or our practices do. And the FCA has taken a big lead in it. I'm very proud of what the FCA has done globally. We've got some strong alliances now with other parts of the world. Singapore, Hong Kong particularly are two examples of area countries that have followed very strongly. I really hope that we'll have the same relationship with Europe, with the EU. We talk a lot about it. There's a lot of desire. I don't see it as a race to see who's got FinTech and who hasn't, because after all, one thing about FinTech is it's pretty borderless.
Yeah. You've said, rules for another time. You've kind of made reference to that. When you look at things like cryptocurrencies, contracts for difference, do you see any need to regulate around initial coin offerings and contracts for difference?
Well, you may have seen that we put out a warning on initial coin offerings, and that was a consumer warning, which frankly, was very blunt. It said you could lose all your money, I think contracts for difference on cryptocurrencies is something, again, new development we hear about. I think it is something that, I have to say, I look at and think, how does that work? And that's the first question we always need to answer. Obviously, the value of cryptocurrencies can fluctuate very widely. Yeah. And I think the question it really begs in that respect is, how do markets in cryptocurrencies work? Because if you write a contract for difference on something, which is priced, has a pricing mechanism, market in the broadest sense. Again, as regulators, we always want to know, how does that market work? Is it open, honest, and transparent? And I have to say there'll be some pretty fundamental questions about that. And when if retail investors are then, in a sense, exposed to contracts for difference in cryptocurrencies, we would have some big questions about level of understanding of the details of the contract and how the underlying markets work.
Questions, but are you planning to take action?
Well, we always ask the questions and then decide what to do. Okay. It's good for regulators to do that.
And on that, in terms of asking the questions, you're working a lot on reform of the asset management industry and also on IPO reform. Yeah. Now, on IPO reform, you're considering creating a listings category to better cater for companies owned by a sovereign country. Is this motivated by a desire to attract the Saudi Aramco IPO?
Oh, everybody always asks me if this is the same. No, first of all, the UK has something called the premium listing system. Which is a standard which is above the minimum EU level. It's not monolithic. Currently there are 3 categories in the premium listing. We're proposing to add a 4th, which would be available to sovereign-owned companies, with some, but not many, modifications allowed in terms of relationships with the owner to reflect, frankly, what we think are the realities of how those companies work. Now, the key thing is that because it's a sort of category, not a monolith, it doesn't have to be, and indeed this has already been said, were it to come to London, it doesn't have to be in the index. In fact, I think most won't be in the index. And that's crucial because it means people don't have to buy it. So my view is, it's transparent, you know what it is. We want London to have open markets. We want people to be able to float in London. We want London markets to be able to do these things and to prosper. But by in a sense being transparent about it being a different category, you know what you're getting. Nobody's forced to buy it. You choose whether you want to buy it.
Mm-hmm. But are you concerned in any way that London might become less competitive post-Brexit, and working on that at all as a regulator?
Well, we have a competition objective. Many people talk about competitiveness. Our view in the FCA is that competition, in a sense, is what we can do to foster competitiveness. So we want to see competition. We like it. We're very supportive of it. We're fairly unusual as a financial regulator to have a full-blown competition regulation objective and set of powers, and we do use them quite actively. And we think that's the best way to foster competitiveness, and we'll go on doing that, yes. Yeah,
just quickly on the asset management industry, because I know it's something you're keen to talk about. Your first of many consultations to reform the industry closed on September 28th. Is it likely that asset managers will have to disclose a single all-in fee to investors?
Well, we're talking to the industry about that. Now, interestingly, by the way, there's a lot of disclosure in MiFID and in the so-called PRIPS regulation, so quite a lot of actually what we've put forward and identified is actually already there in European regulations. So it's not actually as radical as sometimes it's presented. We do support transparency. There is a tricky issue around how you give ex-ante transparency of what I might call the variable element of transactions costs as opposed to the fixed element, which you should be able to do ex-ante. So we're very happy to have a constructive dialogue with the industry about that to come out with sensible solutions. But yes, we are strong supporters of transparency, and we do think this is a sensible thing in the interests of investors. And that, by the way, this will make London more competitive because we think investors want to operate in that environment.
And finally, Andrew, would you consider succeeding Mark Carney as Bank of England governor?
I have always said throughout my career that I do not spend my time thinking about what I want to do in the future. I've never planned my career. It's widely known that I wasn't expecting to be chief executive of the FCA. I hugely enjoy being chief executive of the FCA. Fascinating place to work in. So I'm happy doing this job.
You're happy,
and I think Mark's happy being governor of the Bank of England.
You're not planning to move on, but are people asking you to?
Well, I get asked about every month by somebody. But look, honestly, I always say to people, I do not, and I actually don't recommend other people do it, live my life trying to work out what I want to do in the future. I actually just enjoy what I do now.
Would you enjoy being Bank of England governor? Would you be good at it, do you think?
Oh, I'm not going to comment on that. I've known the last, I've known the last four actually very well. So they've all been very different characters. There's not one person who can be Bank of England governor.
Thank you so much.
You're
Andrew
welcome.
Bailey,
Thank you.
FCA CEO.